So welcome everyone to both ends 3, Dreaming of Home with Gemma Rolls-Bentley. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bio. I'm a white woman with a long brown hair and bangs. Behind me there is a detail of an artwork from the museum's collection. It's a colorful work on paper made by Consuelo Chelo Gonzalez Amezcua, and I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum. A quick note that today's program includes live interpretation in American Sign Language and closed captioning in English. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. So we're thrilled to celebrate the artists of our collections with our current exhibition, Somewhere to Roost, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until May 25th, along with the concurrent exhibition Madalena Santos Rainbolt, A Head Full of Planets. After Material Witness, folk and self-taught artists at work, and marvels of my own inventiveness, Somewhere to Roost is the third in a series of thematic shows drawn from the museum's collection. Curated by Brooke Wyatt, former AFAM's assistant curator, this series of exhibitions invites us to admire the museum's collection up close while showcasing an expansive history of American art. So Brooke and I envisioned a series of online programs that accompany this exhibition series. It's an exploration of the collection that expands on Brooke's interpretation of the objects and fosters new scholarship. So we've titled this series Both Ends in reference to the late artist and writer Lauren O'Grady, who used the concept of both ends to think in a non-hierarchical and non-binary way. This idea serves as a methodological tool for moving beyond the traditional divisions between untrained, skilled, craft art, and amateur fine art, categories that have historically marginalized the fields of folk and self-taught arts. For each program, we invite a curator, an artist, and an educator to critically engage with the history and specificity of our collection, while offering fresh perspectives on the objects and their makers' practices. Brooke is currently completing her PhD in History of Art and Architecture at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm grateful for her presence today and delighted to welcome her back at the museum for the 3rd installment of the series Both Ends. Hi, Brooke. Thank you for being here. I'm also honored to welcome Gemma Rolls-Bentley, a curator and art writer from London, whose curatorial practice amplifies the work of female and queer artists while providing a platform for art that explore LGBTQIA+ identity. Gemma recently published her first book, Queer Art, From Canvas to Club and the Spaces Between, which she will discuss further throughout the program. So before I hand it over to Brooke and Gemma, let me go over a few technicalities. This program will last for about an hour. There will be time for Q&A, so please share your questions throughout the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll be using the chat room to share more details about the program, but the speaker, and also I'll share a link to the speaker script and also a PowerPoint presentation, so you can use those documents to consult them independently if you want to. And if you need any additional information, you can drop me a line in the chat. Today's program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. And again, we offer ASL interpretation, and closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Our museum is grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online, which will not be possible without you. And I hope you'll consider supporting our program through a donation to the museum following this conversation. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to support the work of folk and self-taught artists. So thank you. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers. Please take it away.
Thank you, Mathilde.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, for being here. Thank you to Richard, our tech director, and to our interpreters, Rena and Mackenzie. I'm Brooke Wyatt, and I was the loose curator, loose assistant curator at the American Folk Art Museum between 2022 and 24. And what we're looking at now is an installation view of the third exhibition that I worked on at the museum, Somewhere to Roost. And so I'm gonna talk a bit about this exhibition as it relates to the idea of home, which is a huge idea that I wanted to be in dialogue with for a couple of reasons. Specifically because it allowed me to explore the idea of both and that Mathilde and I have been inspired by Lorraine O'Grady's work and other thought histories in seeking out relationships between objects and humans and non-humans that can be understood and engaged with in a non-hierarchical framework. So rather than either this or that, or one thing is sort of more elevated than another, both and here's allowing multiple realities to coexist. So for this exhibition, Somewhere to Roost, the idea of home was so vast that it really allowed for this kind of both and exploration. It allowed me to include both works of historical folk art from AFAM's collection and contemporary works of self-taught art. It allowed me to consider home as both a site of care and comfort and home as a space possibly of confinement. Both home as something tangible and something metaphorical, like a memory or a dream. I also thought about home as an artist's living space and sometimes also working space, studio space, or even exhibition space. And finally, home as a site or a structure, a physical location. And also maybe home can be the objects that are made in the home and then used in the home, such as quilts, furniture. There's a blanket chest in this show. And finally, the idea of home as not being tethered to a site or a physical structure, but maybe home is in the body. Maybe home is other people, our chosen family, ancestors, a place that we identify with. Okay, so. The title of the exhibition, Somewhere to Roost, was directly borrowed from the title that Thornton Dial Sr. gave to this artwork on the right. Birds got to have somewhere to roost. I had chosen to include this work. It's large, it comes off the wall in a very structural way, it's very heavy. I knew I wanted to include this work in the show, but when I focused in on the way that Dial uses the title to express a metaphor that he's getting at in a pretty abstract way in his composition, it kind of brought these ideas of home together and added this element of the roost or the nest, a place where birds or bats rest for the night, seek shelter. And the way that Dial phrases the title when he says birds got to have somewhere to roost, I appreciated that he's emphasizing the necessity of rest, of finding kinship, of self-care and community care. And he's using this title for a work that is made from found materials that are they're rough, unfinished. They're reused, repurposed, and they're carrying traces of their former use. They've been reconfigured. I included this photo of Thornton Dial, the artist, on the left, because when I saw it, he's holding his hand up and gesturing. He's looking off into the distance. He's inside his studio. And the camera's focused on his face, so his hand is blurred, and that gesture for me evoked a bird. And then I started to see that shape and that kind of fluidity echoed in the artwork in these shards of metal that Dial has nailed into the surface. And a quote from Dial that really helped me keep thinking about the relationship between being free to express yourself and the importance of having a place that it's safe to rest and to do that, the importance of rest and home for artistic expression. In a quote from Thornton Dial where he said, "Art is the expression of my freedom." Okay, so in a contrast, here's that both and aspect. Here's a work of historical folk art. It's a bird cage made from mahogany and whalebone, possibly made by a sailor during a whaling voyage, and possibly used as an actual cage for a bird who was a pet to the sailors on this whaling ship. And then in order for Joseph Clapp to bring the bird home when he came back to land after 3 to 5 years at sea, the bird had to be put into captivity. So the object itself is so beautiful and intricately rendered in terms of the craft that went into making it. And at the same time, it's a home for a bird, but it's a cage. So that tension between security and confinement was something I wanted to really explore. And the last image I'm going to share right now from the show is a drawing by the artist's name is Cruz Santiago, but we just know that from the signature that is here, and the artist also writes Cuomo Puerto Rico or Cuomo PR. And the story of how this drawing came into the museum's collection. An occupational therapist, Anna Conti, was working at Montefiore Hospital in the Bronx, New York. And Cruz Santiago, the artist who made this artwork, was a patient in the hospital receiving treatment for tuberculosis. And he drew this artwork on a piece of paper that was used to line a trash bin, garbage pail in the hospital, this orange paper. And this is the only known work that this artist left behind that is known to the Folk Art Museum, at least. But we know that he made this while he was in the Bronx, and yet he identifies trees and birds in Spanish, as well as writing Como Puerto Rico. So it seems that he is depicting a memory of home. And we don't know if he was able to return there, if he recovered. But I thought this was a beautiful evocation of the way that home, memories of home, imagining or dreaming or remembering a home, including the trees and the birds, as well as as a structure, was just as powerful as a physical space. And I was really excited to be in touch with Gemma because while I was working on putting this show together, I had a chance to see the exhibition she curated, Dreaming of Home. So I'm going to ask Gemma to tell us about that show, and I'll turn it over to her now. I've got to go back, sorry.
That's okay. Thank you, Brooke. Thanks. It's so interesting to hear more about the show and to see some images of the work included. Yeah, this is a great place for me to start. This is the right image. So yes, I curated the exhibition Dreaming of Home that opened in September 2023 at the Leslie-Lohman Museum of Art in New York. And the exhibition idea came from this artwork that we can see on the poster here. This is the poster for the exhibition. And the artwork that's included is Catherine Opie's self-portrait cutting, a piece that she made in 1993. And this is my favorite artwork of all time. You know, I was recently asked if you could steal one artwork in an art heist, what would it be? And this was an easy answer for me because I love this artwork. And I think the reason I love it so much is because I feel that Kathy very successfully articulates feelings that I really relate to, that I think are quite difficult to articulate in words. And it's a really good demonstration of the power of art, the success of art in communicating difficult or sensitive ideas. And the image is, it's a self-portrait of the artist, and you can see on her back that she has an image cut into her skin, and it's a childlike image of a house with clouds, two birds, and two figures wearing dresses holding hands. And the artwork itself is, you know, kind of full of art historical references. There is a dark emerald green drapery on the back that looks like something from a Holbein painting. And the cutting on Kathy's back is a reference to the Leatherdyke SM scene that she was part of in San Francisco in the 90s. And I mean, there's so much that you can read into this work, and the artist has spoken about this work in lots of different ways. But the bit for me that really, really I connected with was this idea of dreaming of something that is very painful. But there's a mixture in this image, I think, of hope and the kind of painful elements of that dream. And you know, they really made me think about what it is to dream as a queer or trans person and what that meant in 1993 when Kathy was making this work and what that means now. It was 30 years later when we opened the show. And I wanted to put Kathy's work in dialogue with artists, young artists making work now. And I had previously hung a 93 photograph of Kathy's, a different one, in a group setting with other younger artists. And a lot of people had been kind of blown away by the shared qualities and the visual language, how similar it looked, you know, with this work 30 years ago to the work being made now. You know, and I think that when we're thinking about the queer experience, it's really important, and art, it serves a brilliant kind of tool for doing this, to connect and build community through time and space. And so when I curated the exhibition Dreaming of Home, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to put artists who are making work 30 years apart in dialogue. You know, Kathy's still making work now, but this piece is very much from that first body of work that she was making. And the Leslie-Lohman Museum is the only museum dedicated to LGBTQIA plus art in the world. It has a huge collection of 25,000 pieces. And so the show was very much taking place in a queer context. And I wanted this show to take a nuanced look at queer identity and the queer experience. And I was thinking about home because of what this work means to me personally. And then I was thinking about, what the idea of home means within LGBTQIA plus communities. And a little bit like what you talked about, Brooke, I was really thinking about home, not just as a domestic space or as four walls being rooted to a place or a building, but something that could be about family or dreams or I think with the queer and trans community, particularly, even this notion of feeling at home in one's own body is something that comes up a lot and comes up in the work. And so the exhibition featured 20 artists. And you can see this image here is an installation shot. When you walk into the gallery, we had painted some of the walls in this blood red to speak to the image in Kathy's photograph. And the artists in the show were all exploring home in very, very different ways. One of the pieces that you can see here is a metal sculpture by a British artist called Roe Robertson. And Roe made this piece specifically for the exhibition. They were very much, they are equally, as much as me, inspired by Kathy's work. And they made a piece that, they're very interested in, ideas around the queer body and how the body interacts with the environment, particularly the natural environment. And this piece is made by pieces of welded steel. And you can really see clearly where the pieces are joined together, and there's almost like scarification where the pieces come together. It's quite visceral. And there's something about this work that is at once, quite hard and resilient, but also quite vulnerable, I would say, in the way the structure, is kind of very small and narrow at certain points. And it just feels like a kind of beautiful metaphor for the non-binary experience that Roe is exploring in their work. And yeah, so this idea of home, it's something that I tackled. I then kind of went on to write this book, Queer Art from Canvas to Club and the Spaces Between. I had been thinking a lot about spaces, home being one of those spaces. And when I made this book, I was invited to make a book that was about queer art. I knew exactly what I wanted this book to be when I was invited to do it, because this book just did not exist. And the book has almost 200 artworks included. And it is a look at contemporary art and how it reflects the queer experience, either very explicitly or implicitly. And the book, I deliberately did not organize this book chronologically. I wanted the book to feel very accessible to anybody. I wanted people within the queer community to, whether they're interested in art or not, to see that there is all of this art about us that reflects our experience. But I also wanted people outside of the community to be able to pick up this book and gain some insight into our experience. And the artists in the book come from all over the world, and it really speaks to the multifaceted nature of the LGBTQIA plus experience. But the way I've organized this book is in 3 acts: queer spaces, queer bodies, queer power. And each act has 3 or 4 chapters. Home is one of the chapters in the Queer Spaces Act. So is outside and the club. And then we have love, intimacy, visibility. Queertopia is the final chapter. And I very deliberately used these universally understood and broad themes because I wanted it to be a way into the work. And to go back to that idea I mentioned earlier of building community through space and time, I also wanted to do that in the book, and make connections between artists who are existing in different parts of the world in different decades. This is another installation shot from the exhibition, and in the front you can see a beautiful sculpture by Chiffon Thomas, who works with Bible skins specifically. And so he grew up in a very religious household, and the Bibles are something that he revisits a lot in his work. And he goes and picks them up in charity shops and takes the skins off and thinks about all the hands that have touched them and all of the faith that has been connected to that object. And then he stitches them together in quite a raw way. And what he creates are these houses or residential structures. And this one specifically speaks to the housing complex that he was raised in Chicago. And then, yeah, you can see lots of other work in the exhibition, lots of photography, painting, and we will dig into more of that as we keep chatting. And we've included this slide because this is something that Brooke and I were talking about when we were talking about the parallels between the work in the American Folk Art Museum collection and queer art and some of the artists that I work with. And one of the things that we were talking about is as Brooke shared in her presentation, with some of these artists, there is so little information available about that artist experience, about the kind of social context or very specific moments. And there's often when we're looking back at art history and we're looking for artists or stories that have perhaps been excluded or erased from our histories, so the artists who tend to have been marginalized in some way, it can be really tricky to piece together those stories and to really understand the intent of the artist. And so I gave this artist as an example, Gustav Caillebotte, whose work has recently been exhibited a lot more, and there's been a big debate in the media about his work because it has been suggested in recent exhibitions that he's making work with a queer gaze. And I have heard lots of people say that they see this work and it's giving gay to them. And there's been lots of controversy about that because nobody knows about the artist's identity, how, he identified in terms of his sexuality. But I think it brings up this question of, does it matter? So much of the conversation can be around the experience between the artwork and the viewer, beyond that conversation around the artist and the artwork. It's something that extends beyond. And I think that as a kind of framework for this conversation and thinking about some of the parallels there and thinking about this curatorial framework and how we position work and how we have conversations about work where, there's a lot of curatorial work involved in filling the gaps and, rewriting histories, reframing histories, or taking a creative approach to imagining histories.
Okay. Thank you, Gemma. I'm gonna keep going with this idea of art making as a space where that allows experimentation and expression, including with dreaming about what home might mean and representing that, and including expressing emotions, relationships, memories, gender identities, self-fashioning, self-presentation. And with a large gift from Peter J. Cohen's collection, AFAM has a wide selection of these hand-tinted vernacular photographs that span much of the 20th century, but many of them are undated, and almost all of them, in almost every case, we do not know who the photographer was, or with this hand tinting where someone has taken a wax crayon or watercolor paint or even oil paint or a ballpoint pen and intervened on the surface, highlighting certain areas. So we also don't know if the photographer is the same person that did that intervention of hand tinting and choosing certain areas to highlight, or not. But I love how each of these photos then kind of exists as this portal to explore and imagine the spaces, the people, the relationships. Some of the photos of the exterior and interior of homes that don't have any people in them actually are really evocative for me as well, because you have that kind of emptiness, and also that question about who is it that whose presence is there, even if their body is not visible or not represented. Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay. Apologize for having trouble with changing the slides today. And here's another series of these photographs. Some of these were in Somewhere to Roost. Some of these were in another exhibition that I worked on at the museum. And this group of photos shows people posing for the camera, wearing special clothing, a zoot suit or a sailor's uniform or dresses. And then we can notice that whoever did the hand tinting, specifically used color to highlight the clothing choices of the figures. And they're also doing activities. Somebody's straddling a motorcycle. Someone's leaning up against a car. Someone's riding a bicycle. So I like to think about how the space of this photography, the space of artistic expression, as it became more accessible with cameras being more affordable, home kits being available at drugstores for doing this hand tinting, that this milieu became a place where you could act, you could embody different identities, you could express different identities, you could play with gender, you could play with different forms of identity. In one of these photographs, the figure is holding a camera, and I see them as claiming this artistic subjectivity and agency as a photographer in a way that's really powerful. So yeah, I think thinking through Gemma's work with Dreaming of Home and in her book, it's exciting to look back at objects like these photographs and imagine possible queer and trans histories across time and place, but sharing that space of artistic expression.
And actually, I think those hand-tinted photographs are so beautiful, and I'm so delighted that we've been able to include them in this presentation. And the first ones that you showed with the interior and exterior of home really made me think about something that for me was quite a pivotal moment. There was an exhibition at Tate Britain about 8-9 years ago called Queer British Art, and there were a series of paintings included in that exhibition that were domestic interiors, and they had been painted by Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant, and members of the Bloomsbury Group, who were a very strong queer community, spent a lot of their time at a house called Charleston on the South Coast, which is a house museum with full of artistic interventions. And seeing those domestic interiors in the context of a queer art exhibition, which was quite a landmark moment in itself. It was one of the first times the word queer was being used in that moment by such a mainstream institution to talk about an exhibition. It was very interesting to think, those domestic interiors, if you didn't know what you were looking at or who had made them or the history of the community who spent time in those domestic interiors, there's no reason to think that it's queer art. But once you have that context, then of course it becomes a really important lens to look at the work through, because I think, for queer and trans people like anybody, to be able to see ourselves reflected in art and histories that we feel really connected to is a very validating experience, and that is something that, depending on our age, it's not necessarily something that we grow up with or are growing up with, depending on where we live as well. Um, and I think Alice Austen is a really interesting example of that. So the next big exhibition I'm working on in North America is at the Alice Austen House, which is in Staten Island. And Alice Austen was a photographer who started making work in the late 19th century. She's now considered, one of the most important American photographers, one of the most important early photographers. And the fact that she was a woman makes it even more exciting. But Alice spent most of her life living in the house on Staten Island that was her family home, that's called Clear Comfort, which is a name her mother had given to the house. And Alice lived there with her partner Gertrude for 54 years. And, that by all accounts, they were very much in love. It was a domestic partnership. And prior to living there with Gertrude, Alice had many other lovers. This hot person holding a bicycle on the right-hand side, Daisy Elliott, was a gymnast, athlete, and there's letters between Daisy and Alice that demonstrate their love affair. And Alice and her mates used to hang out at Clear Comfort. It's this beautiful waterside home. There's a lawn that goes right down to the water, and there's all these photographs here of them hanging out, embracing, engaging in pretty dykey activities, lots of gardening and bicycling. And actually, that image of Daisy holding the bike was one of many that were then used as the illustrations for a book called Bicycling for Ladies. But the key part of the story is that the very explicit queerness in these photographs, which are considered really important in the history of photography, was really excluded from any conversations around the work. And, the home, the current director, Victoria Monroe, is a great, advocate for LGBTQIA plus culture. And the home, as well as being a photography museum, is also a really important site for queer history. And when I have spent time in that house, I feel some kind of magic, and there's a real power to feeling connected to queer ancestors through a space like that, but also through these photographs. And Alice has a beautiful shell collection, which I'm going to be exhibiting in my show. My show explores the relationship between lesbians and the seashore. And Alice photographed the water a lot. There were over 2,000 glass plate photographs of the water and the waterways that she took. And lots of other lesbians have also explored the water, and specifically coastlines and the beaches, in their work. And so I'm bringing together a group of them in this exhibition. But, these photographs, if the work hadn't been done to look at the history that goes with them and to really understand and be able to celebrate it, we wouldn't have that, even though it's the writing is on the wall. The queer content is pretty explicit. But yeah, I think this idea of home and art kind of coming together, and that kind of space, like I spoke about with Charleston, as well as Clear Comfort, is something I know, Brooke, you were really interested in as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I've included one of Nellie Mae Rowe's drawings on the left here, and another artwork by Nellie Mae Rowe on the right that includes a photograph of the artist. So it's a self-portrait. And she's one of many artists in AFAM's collection who turned their living space, both indoors and outdoors, into an art environment. So a studio slash art installation, exhibition, slash the creation of an environment where every element and every facet is part of the artwork. and also gets represented in the artwork. So the drawing on the left, which is on view right now at AFAM in Somewhere to Roost, is showing us animals, a dog, some birds, a human figure, and most of all, flowers and really bright colors. And we can imagine that Nellie Mae Rowe is drawing inspiration from her home and her garden specifically. She called her house the Playhouse, and she designed handmade dolls and painted on furniture, and the trees in her yard outside had sculptural elements that she hung in them. And I really love to explore the relationship between documentation, where we can see photographs of her playhouse and her yard, and then see how she represented the elements of her home in her work. And in this self-portrait image, she's also doing that artistic self-fashioning and using color and intervening on the photograph to assert herself as part of this art environment as well as its creator at the same time. And I love how she celebrates her communion with nature and with animals. And sadly, her home has been demolished to make way for it, the city of Atlanta, Georgia's expansion. So we have her artwork as documenting this environment that she created. You.
These 4 photographs were exhibited in Dreaming of Home, and actually the museum was able to acquire a couple of Lawrence's photographs as well following the show, which was really exciting. These photographs are made by Lawrence Philomene, who works with this very distinctive, highly saturated fluorescent color palette in their photography. And it's from a greater body of work called Puberty, in which they are documenting their gender transition and within their home space. The image in the top left, the dollhouse in a snowstorm, is not actually their house. It's just a house that they saw that looked beautiful with those lights on. And again, I think it's all part of this conversation about the dream and dreaming. It doesn't have to be your house, your home, or it doesn't have, to be part of your kind of dream of home. And then we've got the bedside table, bottom left, the angel chimes. I grew up with angel chimes, and we used to get them out every Christmas. And when I saw that image, there's something in these works for me that's about ritual and queer spirituality. And I think, again, those are themes that are really strong within this topic of home. So much of what queer people, and particularly queer artists, are doing is forging new ways of living and existing and surviving and being, and ultimately, we hope, thriving. And I think that is captured so beautifully in this body of work. But yeah, Lawrence is an artist who, I think it's very interesting thinking about what might have been only 10, 15 years ago considered as a traditional path to success for an artist. Attending certain universities and having certain residencies and appearing in certain museums and institutions and gallery representation and that kind of thing. Like lots of Lawrence, like lots of the artists included in Dreaming of Home, didn't necessarily follow that super traditional path. Although some of the artists in the show did and have had great success in the commercial and museum world, in the art world. But I think that is something that the contemporary art world is really opening up to much more now, is thinking about artists who have not followed those traditional paths or haven't been to specific art schools. There's lots of alternative ways of learning, and it's something, I think as that we open up in that space, I also think that we see more queer and trans representation and more representation of, other marginalized identities, because it's not always accessible for people to go to university or do a residency or make work, that when they don't have to do other jobs at the same time. So yeah, it was really exciting that we were able to acquire some of this artist work for the museum. And, Brooke, you and I spoke about some of the parallels with Lee Godey's work, and Lee's work to me just feels so contemporary, and it was one of when I was looking through your collection, I was just so excited to discover her work, which I hadn't seen before. And the figurative work with the birds and the portraits, to me, speaks to artists like Kiki Smith and other artists that we see lots of and we know lots about. And actually, and it's good that Lisa Slaminski is on this call. She said at the beginning, but she made this beautiful book called Nonconformers. And in that book, I was reading much more about Lee Godey, and there's some really great self-portraits, photographs of Lee's, where she writes on them and draws on them with biro in the same way that she uses in her drawings. And it reminded me of, yeah, you're going to go on and show that some more of these now, I know, but I just feel like there's so many parallels with so many of the artists that were in my show and artists that I'm thinking about all the time as well.
Yeah, thank you, Gemma, for that beautiful framing of what you were talking about, the opening up and consideration of multiple pathways towards artistic identity and expression, multiple sites of learning, and many different ways that an artistic community might look aside from a conventional art world, institution, commercial gallery centered MFA program track, so to speak. And Lee Godey, we're looking at her artwork that is in Somewhere to Roost. There is an anecdote that Lee recounted as part of her, almost like her story of becoming an artist, that it was a red bird that told her to paint. So this image does include a red bird as well as a white bird, and she signs her name in the center of this piece of unstretched canvas. She signs it Artist Lee Godey. And I included a photograph of the artist on the left here that was taken by collectors and who are also doing research and meeting artists, and went to visit her on the steps of the Chicago Art Institute, the Art Institute of Chicago, where Lee Godey sometimes made her work, spent a lot of time, and sold her work, exhibited and sold her work. So she inserted herself into this art institution, this art school and museum, and identified herself as an impressionist, for example. And so this photograph shows her in an interaction with some collectors that were buying her work. And I loved how she poses for the photograph, and she's embodying this idea of being an artist despite not having had formal art training herself. And this is happening while she is living unhoused on the streets of Chicago, after leaving the home and family life that she had previously, and following this path of making artwork and living in the city, and documenting and positioning herself as an artist in this particular way. This is one of a series of photo booth self-portraits that she made. And as Gemma mentioned, she's taken a ballpoint pen in this case and added color to the artist palette that she's holding. She's holding a roll of that unstretched canvas that she used to make the red bird artwork that we saw in the previous slide. She's got a cameo brooch, piece of jewelry, kind of fastening her clothing together, and she's holding up her artist's tools, and she has inscribed in this case on the back that it's Lee in a large hate, and maybe that was a hat, maybe it was a reference to a different photo, we don't know, but I think it speaks to the artist kind of inserting herself into different personas and different ways of expressing herself as an artist that I think were done on her own terms. And so when we look at her work, I think it's on the one hand, it's easy to project like, oh, this is a beautiful story of someone kind of finding their artistic career, and it's somehow to hold that at the same time with the reality that she was in a situation of extreme insecurity in terms of her housing and access to a safe shelter. And it does make me think again about Thornton Dial's idea about art being the expression of his freedom, as he said, and that's what I see in Lee Godey's self-portrait photo booth photos, especially that art making and artistic identity as a space of free expression.
And on that theme of
photographs,
theme of artistic identity as a space of expression, here we've got two gorgeous parts of Dreaming of Home. On the left is a group of photographs by Rini Matic, and on the right is a painting by Nicole Eisenman. Nicole had made that painting 5 years before the exhibition, and when I presented this idea to them about Dreaming of Home, that it would be a group show about queer identity, Nicole, who is a very successful artist represented by Hauser and Wirth, one of the biggest commercial galleries in the world, is in museums all over the world, said to me, oh, good, I'm really delighted to be included in a queer exhibition and an exhibition that talks about queer identity, which I thought was very interesting to hear. And then on the left, we've got this group of photographs by Rini. And Rini is a young British artist. They were the youngest artist ever to be acquired by the Tate. And when the Tate Britain did its recent rehang, they installed a whole wall of Rini's photographs, which was really wonderful to see. And Rini, they photograph their community, the people they love. Photographing people is their way of loving people and showing love. A lot of their images come from nighttime spaces and clubs, spaces that traditionally have offered a lot of solace and acceptance to queer people. A lot of queer people find themselves and their community in these spaces, and seeing them captured through Rini's photographs and honored in that ways and elevated in that ways, really meaningful, I think. But Rini didn't train as a photographer. They went to art school. They did a fine art degree at Central St. Martin's, but their photographs are beautiful. But it's not something that they were taught to do. They just picked up a camera and started making photographs. And it's something that they don't like being described as a photographer. But they also work in video performance. They make flags. There is a they have a beautiful book and a whole body of work that's called Flags for Countries That Don't Exist, but Bodies That Do. And they think a lot in their work about the Black British experience growing up in Peterborough, in the Midlands, where they're from, and what it means to exist in a country that's building systems to exclude you. And they just recently did made a collaborative record with a singer called Campbell King called Ruin It. And in Reenie's bit, they say, I'm over body as concept, I'm over home as concept. And then later on they say, I want to build home in the love. And it's just, to me, I mean, I listen to that song every day. It's so good. And I just think it's such a beautiful way to look at the queer experience and queer creativity. And that really comes through in Reenie's beautiful photographs.
I wonder if we can stop here and have more of a discussion. Maybe we can ask Mathilde to join us again.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much to both of you for looking back at the collection from a queer lens, also seeing how our fields intersect in such an interesting way, and feel very connected. So thank you for doing that, Gemma, and for joining us, and also for looking at our collections through this contemporary lens. I don't see any questions, but please share your questions with us. We'll have 10 minutes to take some questions, and I'm sure you have some ideas you'd like us to expand on. I know that there was early on a question about the first image you discussed, Gemma, of Catherine Opie, about the making of that piece. If you have more information about the process of making the piece and the tattoos on the back, that would be great.
Yes, that piece, actually, Catherine recently staged an exhibition at her commercial gallery in Los Angeles, Regan Projects, that was called Harmony is Fraught. And it looked back at lots of her bodies of work. And one of the pieces in that show was a video of that piece being made, which was so interesting to see. It's just like very rough footage on a handheld camera. And I've heard anecdote. I mean, that piece and the story around its creation is kind of a piece of, I would say, like it's like a lesbian, like there's like a lesbian iconography around that whole thing, and like you hear all these stories and anecdotes. And I once heard an artist say, I was in the building when that was being made. It's like it's such an important work, I think, to so many people. But yeah, Kathy was, as I mentioned, part of this leather SM scene, and body modification was definitely part of that practice. But for that specific piece, the 1993 work, she really wanted the image to appear naive and childlike. And so the friend that she brought in to do the cutting was not somebody from that scene. It wasn't somebody who had ever done that kind of cutting, because she wanted it to be rough, and it is, and you can see the blood pouring down. But actually, 1 year later, she made another work called Self-Portrait Pervert, where she is front on, wearing a gimp mask with needles in her arms, and she has the word pervert cut into her chest, and that word is cut in perfectly because that was done by a very experienced cutter. And then 10 years after that, in 2004, she made the third piece in that trilogy called Self-Portrait Nursing. And in that piece, you can see the scar of the word pervert, but she is breastfeeding her son, Oliver. And so the three pieces together, I think, make a very interesting and powerful story. And particularly the image of her breastfeeding. I'm a queer mother, and I know many queer mothers who have said that that piece of work made in 2004, apart from also maybe the television series The L Word that Catherine Opie's work featured heavily in, were really the only representations of queer motherhood, of like very explicitly lesbian identifying motherhood, parenthood. And so yeah, it's a really interesting group of work.
Where motherhood is maybe another topic to explore in a show that I was wondering if you if so please share questions if you have any question for us. We have a few minutes before we close the program. Yeah, I was wondering, Gemma, if you have encountered in your long career and research any images that were made by self-taught artists or what will you call self-taught artists or folk or identified makers, and if you could talk about this experience working with these objects and why do you think they catch your eyes and how did you approach them?
It's an interesting question. I think I'm working on a book at the moment for Thames and Hudson, which is another queer art book, part of a series called Art Essentials. And in the introduction, I'm including much, much more historical work as context for this conversation around queer art. And there I have medieval art, I have French Bibles, there are also classical sculptures where there is very clear homoerotic imagery, or particularly with the medieval images, there are illustrations of the very well-known stories about gender variant saints, as they were known, saints who changed their sex. And most of those, we don't know who made them, but they're such important pieces to consider. And I think they contribute so much to the conversation around queer culture and queer identity. And then in terms of self-taught artists, thinking about artists in a contemporary setting, yes, I do come across, as I mentioned, I see so many more artists now kind of coming up and getting opportunities that are self-taught. And actually, there's quite a few artists that I've been working with over the last couple of years who have come to and I find this a really interesting pattern I'm seeing, but quite a few artists who have come to art making in perhaps their late 30s, 40s, or even 50s after having gone away and had another career. And, I think there's something, and class often comes into that, to pursue a career as an artist in the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, was perhaps something that felt difficult or maybe wouldn't be taken seriously or wouldn't be a career where you can make money. But then I also think the way that that can intersect with queer or trans identity is really interesting, because what I've seen with some of the artists I work with is perhaps they didn't have the confidence in themselves, their own creativity, because of their own identity journey, to go away and pursue that as a career option. One artist that I'm working with at the moment on a solo show is called Zach Toppin, and he went and had a career as a hairdresser. And then as he was approaching 40, said, if I don't go and get a painting studio and make work now, I'm never going to have a career as an artist. And that moment really coincided with him leaning into his trans identity, changing his name, changing his pronoun. And the work that he's been making is amazing. And, we've done a couple of projects together, and the reception has been like overwhelmingly positive. And I do think it's interesting to consider an artist's gender, sexuality, and the journey in relation to that, and think about some of those artists who come to art making later, or perhaps haven't been to art school. And Zach he did like a 1-year foundation course at Camberwell in London, I don't know, 20 years ago, and then had gone and been a hairdresser, had like parked it there, and then came back to it, all these years later. And that's something that I've seen quite a lot with queer and trans artists that I'm working with. Another artist actually that I'll mention I bought a work by recently is a brilliant tattoo artist called Cash Francis, who made this tattoo on my arm, my wife's name. And he's a really talented tattoo artist. But he exhibited some work in a gallery, and they're pencil drawings, colored pencil drawings, and they are so good. So good, because of course, to be a tattoo artist, you have to be very talented with, your penmanship. And again, it's someone who hasn't been and studied art, but now I'm seeing the work in galleries. I've seen him in a couple of shows, and again, I think that kind of confidence to go into that as a career is tied in with his trans identity as well. And so something very interesting to consider.
Yeah, totally, especially as it echoes from our own the artists we have in the collection. We have a lot of artists who start making art at in retirement time, when they are finished with their career and they feel they have the time, also the economic means, because also there is a lot of economic restriction, and I'm sure Brooke can add a lot to that. And I think it echoes what you were talking about, this idea of like art as also a place of liberation, and not only artistic, but also a way of liberating yourself and expressing yourself. How these two are connected. It's a beautiful way also of looking at art and our need for art. Maybe Brooke, you want to add something here?
I have lots I could say, but I will just mention two of the artists that we looked at their work in Somewhere to Roost. First, Nellie Mae Rowe. We saw her really colorful oil pastel drawing and the photograph of her that she added color to, and then created designs and drawings all around the frame. Her house that she called the Playhouse, and her kind of the fluidity between nature outdoors and the indoor space, and herself as both the creator of this art home environment and part of it. And I wanted to mention that she worked for her entire life as a housekeeper in other people's homes. And it wasn't until, in fact, she was a widow, I believe, that she was living on her own. She was no longer taking care of anyone else. She was no longer cleaning other people's homes. And it was at that moment that that her artistic practice really started to, I think, extend to her entire home environment, and to become really her way of living, her way of being in the world. And the other artist I wanted to mention was Thornton Dial. He did, during his lifetime, receive recognition as an artist and see his work be exhibited in major museums and added to collections. But what's not always talked about is the community that he was like an anchor for in Bessemer, Alabama, a steel town where himself, his sons, other members of his family, like the artist Ronald Lockett, were involved in a sort of art community, artistic school of artistic practice, almost in this sense that was through ties of kinship and through ties of being in that place. And so you didn't have to leave to go to the big city per se to go to art school. You could learn a lot about becoming an artist through your network and in your home. And I think that's something that I know it through AFAM's collection, work with their collection, and in my research, I'm just always trying to highlight these paths to making and to creativity and to artistic existence that have historically been under-recognized, erased, and marginalized often, you know. So being self-taught or being mother-taught, as Julia Bryan Wilson, art historian, says, being community-taught, learning, you know, in queer spaces, learning about self-expression in ball culture, for example, or at the club. You know, I mean, I think that the fluidity of the spaces of where art happens, where it's made, and where artistic identities are expressed is so much faster than just the museum or the gallery. And so it's exciting to get to consider that using the resources of these kinds of institutions.
Yeah, that was, I mean, that was such a big theme for me with my book, was thinking about all of the art that didn't exist in a museum or a gallery, or that came out of club culture. And there's a beautiful exhibition in London that's just recently opened at Tate Modern, but which is about the artist Lee Bowery, who ran lots of club nights here in London. He was Australian, and yeah, the show is curated by Fintan Moran, a brilliant curator who was the trusted reader on my book, actually. And it's the first exhibition I think that I've seen that really, really, really brings the club into such a traditional institutional space, and really thinks about that and thinks about the creative expression that occurs in all these different areas of life and different spaces.